All right. Again, thank you for being here. I'm Stephanie Crawford, Executive Director of IDEA. We have a great Wednesday webinar today. I'm so excited because this is one of those things that just happens sometimes. I was lucky enough to get to meet Kory just out of kind of a happenstance. And when she started talking, I was like, yes, this would be great for educators too. So I'm going to give you the few reminders now that at the end, towards the end of the webinar, I will drop a link for Illinois educators to claim their PDH if you'd like it. And then knowing that sometimes we feel more comfortable asking our questions when it's not being recorded, we will have time at the end where we will stop the recording and you'll be able to ask any questions you have. You can also feel free to put any questions into the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on that too, and we can always bring those up. And without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Kory so that she can get us started today.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you. We're going to be talking about creativity and wellness, which are two of my passions. So I'm very excited to share that material with you. And in addition to the presentation at the end, just so you know, there's going to be a short survey. It's going to be like a QR code. You can probably either do that later or try to scan it with your phones. But Stephanie reminded me before the presentation that it will be very easy for you to access it in an email later. So don't stress too much about that when we get to that part of the presentation. I also want to tell you how the structure of the presentation is going to go so that you know what to expect. So the first part of the presentation is the definitions. My definition of creativity and wellness are a little bit different than mainstream definitions. Then I move into the connection between creativity and wellness. And then lastly, I try to talk about ways that you can develop creativity in both your personal and professional lives. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about me as well before we jump into it, just so you know, who is this person? Why is she talking about this? So I am a USA Today bestselling author. I've published 30 books. Also, before I was doing this, I was pursuing my creative entrepreneurship, as I call it. I was an educator for 10 years. I was teaching writing and communication courses to university students. I also serve part-time as the communications director for a small environmental nonprofit that I'm very passionate about, based out of Wisconsin, called Community Conservation. And I use creativity every day in both the personal capacity and professional capacity. So let's jump right into it. Oh, there we go. So who is Kory? What does she create? So we have on the left here, you can see this picture, that's a stack of my books. So I've published 30 books, like I said. A lot of it is fiction, nonfiction, poetry. I actually pursued my MFA in poetry because they don't like it when you write genre fiction in an academic setting. It's not serious enough. So I decided to pursue poetry because I thought I would learn a lot about how to use language, and that would also translate to the other things that I write. I also love to paint, and I love to do audio projects. I'm a podcaster. I have 2 podcasts, the Who Killed My Mother podcast, which is about my mother's death, which I'll share a little bit more about that with you later. And then there's also the Well Cared For Human podcast, which is kind of touching on some of the things that we're going to be discussing today. And I use my creativity in all of these ways and many more. I wonder why it won't let me move my slide. Okay. People ask me what the secret to creativity is. It's being able to continue to produce work even when you have 30 pounds of dog sitting on your kneecap at any given time. So this is my dog, Charlie. He's my constant companion when I'm doing creative projects. As you can see, he's very involved in the creative process. It's very important for him to participate, and he does like to sit right on my kneecaps. So the only thing you need to know in order to be creative is just a high tolerance for pain on your knees, and you will do creative wonders. But more seriously, the use of one's imagination muscle to produce results. That's my definition of creativity. It's a little bit different. We tend to think of artistic endeavors, artistic productions when we think of creativity. But for me, I think it's just using your imagination to produce results, and be certain that I did not say good results. Goodness, skill is not important when we make things. It's just important that you produce something. Other facets of creativity, or how we use that creativity muscle, is when we solve problems, when we do self-expression, or when we find things. And I'll explain a little bit more about what each of those mean. So when we're solving problems, we are basically saying that we believe there is a solution out there. So it cultivates the idea of hope. So we're developing that muscle of hope when we practice creative problem solving. It also makes us develop flexibility of mind, because usually the first 5 or 20 things that we try do not work, and we have to adapt to our situation accordingly. Same for open-mindedness. Often we have to try different things that we had never considered before. And for that reason, we often have to go outside of our comfort zone, look at other opportunities and options. And so it broadens our mind and makes us look at things that we had maybe didn't consider before. Also, it develops self-confidence, because when you are finally able to solve your problem in that way, you feel really good about yourself. You begin to increase your belief that you have the capacity to do more with your creativity, that you can, in fact, achieve results of some kind. Expression is another facet of creativity, another way that we use that creativity muscle when we express emotions. Emotions are usually a very personal experience. How I feel about something, what I experience emotionally in a certain situation is usually unique to me, and that's true for others as well. So how do we convey those emotions to others? How do we connect in that way? And we can do that through the means of creativity. Same for perspective. Often my viewpoint of the world or someone else's viewpoint is not exactly aligned. And so how do we help other people to see what we see, or to experience what we experience, which is the next example? Things that are generally personalized, how do we connect them to other people? Another form of the creativity muscle of expression is energy. So energy is kind of a nebulous term. It's nothing concrete, but you can, in fact, share that with other people. And I have examples of each of these. So the example of perspective is this book by Angie Thomas. I don't know if anyone here has read it, but I think it's an amazing book. It's called The Hate You Give. And the principal character, Star, she experiences watching the death of her friend by police brutality. And she shares what that experience is like, what it was like to lose this friend, what it was like for her to be kind of caught in the maelstrom of this socio-political experience. And so that is very different than the life I live at home on my couch with my 30-pound pug sitting on my kneecaps. And so in order for me to understand that perspective or that experience, I need stories like this in order to bridge that gap between the two. The second example there, that is an abstract painting that I recently completed. And when I was studying painting, my professor explained to me that abstraction is very different than other forms of art, because unlike trying to capture the image of something to show it in a realistic way, you're trying to capture the energy or the emotion of something. So there's not a direct correlation. So you create something so that the viewer can experience what you were experiencing in a more abstract way. So that's one way to capture something like energy. And then the third example is the Who Killed My Mother. So I had an experience on July 4th of 2020. I received 2 phone calls. The first phone call was from my uncle saying that he had gone into my mother's bedroom and had found her dead, and he thought it was from an overdose. But then I received a second phone call from a homicide detective saying that he thought that my uncle was responsible for her death, and they were now going to arrest him for that. So that is a very, fortunately, unique experience. I hope many people are not experiencing that, but how do I convey that experience and that perspective to others? And it's by creating something that I can share and that I can connect, also exploring my emotions and the experience at the same time. So finding, I have it in quotes here because there's different kinds of finding. We find meaning. For example, when I created something like the Who Killed My Mother podcast and I shared that story, I was trying to find meaning in our relationship. And the reason for that is that even though that is a story, it's like a true crime story about the experience of my mother's murder, it's also very much about making meaning of our life together. My mother struggled with a lot of things growing up. So she had mental illness. She was diagnosed with manic depression in the 90s. We don't call it that anymore. Now we call it bipolar. She struggled with substance abuse, and she had a lot of these, I guess, negative factors that were compromising the quality of her life. And so having a mother like that was very challenging, and we had a challenging relationship. But when I told our story, I was able to heal a lot of that because I was able to find meaning in our connection and our shared history. And then when I shared that with other people, I was able to connect with them in that way. So at the end of that podcast, I had finished producing the last episode. I believe it was in 2021. I received many emails from people who talked about having difficult family situations as well, different dynamics that were very difficult to process, to work through. And they felt very seen. They felt, even if our connection was over the internet, and even though we didn't know each other in real life, they still felt as though someone out there understood them. And that understanding is really important because you can find that understanding not just in your own life when you create something, but you find it in other people's experiences as well. I also have heard, I believe it was J.K. Rowling, who said that she never knows how she feels about something until she's written about it. So if you use creativity in that way, if you use that creative muscle, you also have the possibility of figuring out how you feel about something. Like, what do you think about certain issues in the world? What do you think about certain experiences that you've had? So you can also find understanding. And then lastly, you can find yourself. And that sounds very like grandiose and maybe like the theme of a Disney movie. But finding yourself is essentially discovering more about you, what you love, what you're into, what lights you up, what your passions are, and also figuring out things about yourself that maybe you would overlook in other capacities, kind of in a day-to-day existence you wouldn't really think about. So there's a lot to find when you participate in creativity. What creativity is not is skill or talent. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because there is a misconception that only certain people are creative, that you're born with it, that you can do something with it, you're talented, and that other people, they're just not creative, but that's simply not true. And I'm going to show you the difference between skill and talent right now. So on the left, we have a stack of poetry, emo poetry from my high school days, in which I was writing a lot about how my pain resembled rain and all like the crushes that weren't working out for me, things like that, very emotional, emotive stuff. There was absolutely no skill to anything that was recorded in those journals. But then fast forward 15 years, I do have an actual published book of poetry. Those are two very different skill levels. I had to learn how to write poems. I took my first creative writing course. I wrote and rewrote, and then I submitted my poems to journals and I got rejected. And then I had to learn how to do things even better. And then you get to making a book. You have to learn how to put a book together. How does it tell a story? So that's a lot different levels of skill there that's involved. And so it doesn't mean that I was less creative when I was doing this dramatic emotional exploration of poetry in high school. It just means that I did not yet have the skills to do it well. Creativity is also not limited to genre. So this idea that you're only creative in a certain kind of way is also untrue. It's another myth that I would like to debunk. And here are some examples of different ways that I'm creative. So again, we have another one of my paintings in the upper right. As you can see, not that fantastic. It's just like a normal painting. We have some nature photographs there on the bottom. I like to photograph nature, much to the dismay of the squirrels in my yard that I'm chasing around with my camera. They don't really appreciate it, but I have a good time. I also made a audio drama, a very short 8-minute ghost story. I took an audio editing course because I wanted to be a better podcaster. And one of the assignments was you had to create a story with sound effects. And I thought a ghost story would be great because ghost stories are so atmospheric. They've got the spooky music and stuff. And so I chose to do that one. And it's up for free on YouTube, by the way, if you want to see how that turned out. But essentially, Dean Koontz put it really well when he said, I've said a million times that I'm not a horror writer. And what he's explaining there is that he uses his creativity however it suits him. But from a marketing perspective, from the publisher's perspective or the editor's perspective, it's much easier for them to sell a Dean Koontz book if they know where to put it on a shelf in a bookstore. And so they tell everyone that he's a horror writer because it's much easier to sell a book if you can say it's a specific genre. But that is an idea that is mostly constructed from a commercial perspective. When we're talking about just raw creativity, it doesn't have those limitations. So also try to let go of the myth that if you're only creative, you can only be creative in certain ways, or that you can't be creative at all if you weren't born that way. None of that is true at all. And so moving on to what is my definition of wellness? So I've talked a little bit about what creativity is and then what is wellness, since I want to talk about them together. So my definition is a little bit different, and that's for many reasons. Part of it is my lived experience, but another part of it is just, again, there's this difference between commercialization and personalization. Commercialization, wellness is whatever I can sell you. Can I sell you a bath bomb? Can I sell you a face mask? Can I sell you a trip to the Bahamas? So anything that I can sell you is what's defined as wellness. And so, unfortunately, there is that commercial component. But for me, wellness is having a good relationship with yourself, to the point to where you have an ironclad connection to your resiliency, so that no matter what happens, you can always take good care of yourself. You can always rebound from setbacks and things like that. And that relationship I have divided into what I call 4 pillars. It's the relationship with your body, your relationship with your mind and emotions, your relationship with your spirit, and your relationship to others. And I'll explain what each of those mean. So how do you talk to your body? How do you think about your body? Are you kind to your body? When you think about your mind and emotions, I put them together because there's an intimate connection between the two. I don't know if you've ever had a big feeling, for example, anxiety, and how immediately you start thinking all the worst possible things that could be happening, because that's what the mind has been triggered to do by the big emotion. Similarly, if your mind starts thinking about all the terrible things that will happen, you'll start to feel really stressed in your body. And so they're very intimately connected, in my opinion. And then spirit is another one of those vague terms, but essentially it is your creativity, it's your joy, it's your connection to this larger mystery of life. And if you were a spiritual or religious person, that would also exist here, maybe your relationship with God. Religion's not required, but this sense of you and the parts of you that are unseen. I mean, it sounds very esoteric or mystic, but just the parts of you that aren't just corporeal. And then lastly, your loving connections with other people. Do you have healthy people in your life? Do you have people who affirm you, who support you, who care about you? And so that also is part of wellness. What wellness is not is health. So what I mean by that is that some of us, unfortunately, we are not always healthy, or maybe we were born not healthy, or maybe we were born in a different kind of body. And so I want to disconnect the idea that you're only well if you're in good health, which is not true. You can be well even if your body is suffering in a particular time. You can have a great relationship with your mind and emotions. You can still be cultivating joy. You can still have loving connections to other people. So you can still experience wellness even if your body or your health is not cooperating. So I don't view personally these two terms as interchangeable, because we can't always control our health. So it'd be really unfortunate that you just can't be well because your health is not cooperating. So what is the connection between creativity and wellness? So creativity nurtures a lot of different aspects of wellness. So all these different things I contribute to feeling well. So there's satisfaction. So satisfaction is when you do something and you're really excited by the outcome. Take one of my paintings, for example. Usually when I'm doing them, I'm not particularly happy because I'm really frustrated by the results and I want them to be amazing. But when I am done with the process and I look at it, I'm like, oh, actually, that's pretty good. Even if it's not really that good, I'm pleased with the amount of effort that I put into it. And so I get a sense of satisfaction and fulfillment from creating something. I also am able to connect with my joy because I'm doing things that I love, that light me up. It's also very much like play. If you're someone who came from a trauma background, for example, like myself, it's very natural to have forgotten how to play, either because maybe you grew up too quickly or you had so many responsibilities. And then learning to cultivate joy is like learning to play again. So you're reconnecting with that part of yourself that maybe had to be sacrificed in the past. Same for self-esteem. So and personal power, I'm going to use these two together because I remember the first time that I ever gave my first public reading. I was terrified, and I didn't want to get up there and read my words to other people who were looking me in the eyes at the same time. It was a very terrifying experience, but they wouldn't give me my MFA unless I did it. So I had to give a public reading of my work. And I was so nervous, and I got through it shaking, the little papers are shaking while I'm reading my work. But at the end, I got the applause, and I thought, no, they're just being nice to me because they saw me up there trembling. But then a lot of people came up and said really kind and affirming things and pointed out specifically parts that they liked. And so I felt very good about myself. I was like, oh, maybe I can write well, maybe I can do good things. And so it improves your self-esteem as well. When you use your creativity to make these connections with other people, you feel more powerful, like you can do this, you got this. Creativity also nurtures resilience. So resiliency, there's a couple different examples. First and foremost, I don't know anyone who hasn't had to deal with challenges in their life. If there is someone here tonight who is living an easy life with no challenges in it, please feel free to email me at the end and tell me what you're doing differently than me, because I would love your secret. But I personally have encountered many challenges in life, and I think that's pretty standard for people. And so challenges, the way that we deal with those or how quickly we can bounce back from those, that's what I mean by resiliency. A good example of this is this nightmare cake that I have for you. So on the left, we have the cake that someone wanted to make in this beautiful example of a birthday cake. But on the right, we have what actually happened. And this is very common in the creative process, where you set out to make one thing, you have a vision in your mind, you're like certain you're going to put it to the paper that way, or you're going to produce it into the world somehow that way. But then what you get is very different. And you're like, what happened? I have to try this again. And so you keep doing it, and you keep doing it, and you keep doing it until you get something closer to the results that you want. So creativity teaches us resiliency. It teaches us to connect with that ability to keep coming back and trying again and again, even when we face setbacks, which is a wonderful life skill. And then also, if you make the choice of pursuing creativity professionally, like I did with my creative entrepreneurship, there's a lot of things that will happen on that path that are very normal. We hear stories like J.K. Rowling got rejected 100 times, or Dean Koontz didn't get published for 10 years, things like this. And it's because there are roadblocks at every step of the way. First, you have to write the story, and then rewrite the story, and rewrite the story. And then you have to get an agent, but you get rejected from the agents, and then you get an editor, but the editors are saying no. So it becomes very much this cycle of having to get up again after being told no, or having a setback in some way. And so it's a lot of resiliency is built into the creative process as well. So how do we develop our creativity? Hopefully by now I have sold you on the idea that it will give you a lot of benefits, and not just the result of nightmare cakes, but also many other things that you can do in your life with your creativity. And they don't even have to be good. You could just make things and they can still look terrible and you still get the benefits. I want to be very clear about that. It doesn't have to be good results to still get the benefits of creativity. So how do you develop it? How do you make more room for that creativity in your life? So these are some of the ways I like to nurture creativity. There's going to be 6 examples. The first one is saying yes more often than you say no. And think about when you work with children, as I'm sure all of you do. When you say no to a child over and over again, they get discouraged. So if you had, in this example, a child that kept coming to you and they had an idea for an amazing story, and they're like, let's write the story together. And you're like, I can't, I'm so busy. I don't have any time. Let's do it later. And they come again and they're like, no, really, this is great. And you keep telling them no. You keep coming with all the reasons why you can't do it. Maybe you just saw the exorbitant prices of art supplies, for example, and you're like, no, I can't possibly pick this up as a hobby. Why is that $100? And, I got to buy groceries, which is a sticker shock for sure. But this idea of there's many reasons to say no to being creative or to having a creative process. But the more often you say no to yourself, the more quiet that voice is going to to become, because everyone has a creative voice. There's a part of you that wants to make things, and it's not just present in the artistic world as well. So maybe you have a scientific mind and you want to solve solutions in a scientific capacity, such as environmental issues, or maybe you want to invent something. There's a gadget that you've been thinking about forever and you're like, it would just be amazing if I made this thing. Or maybe you're into translation, for example. There's not an exact word in the English language that there is translated into Japanese. So if you would have to make a creative leap there. So any of these instances where we need creativity, if we keep saying no, the voice keeps getting quieter and quieter. And so it can be more difficult to connect with creativity. So nurture that voice so that it's nice and loud and you understand when you want to do something. There's also the advice to try a variety of genre, because again, skill is not important. Just try everything that you want to try for a couple of reasons. One, because you'll figure out more and more what you like, what you're drawn to, what you think is great, but also you'll get to see the different expressions of your creativity, whether that is something artistic or maybe something more strategic or scientific. Whatever it is, you'll get to expand the full capacity of your creativity by trying all these different things. I also recommend that you be a doer, not a viewer. And so what I mean by that, I don't know if we have any Great British Bake Off fans here tonight, but but I like that show. I like to watch people freak out in a tent running around trying to make their shortbread recipe come together in time before they get the little bell. But it's really fun to watch other people do things. It's really fun to appreciate other people's art, or maybe you like to appreciate other people's music. Nothing wrong with that. I think that's a great way to connect with your joy. But it's also very important for you to try to make the thing yourself. So on the right, we have my friend Victoria, who made me a chocolate cake for my last birthday. As you can see, that chocolate cake is falling apart. It is like melting down the side and like sliding off onto my table. But it was a very delicious cake. I absolutely loved it. And also, you could see the joy on her face of having given me this cake that she worked really hard to make for me. And so you can't get that level of joy or use that to connect with others if you're not actually participating in the creative process. So I encourage you to try to do the things, not just appreciate the things as well. Other suggestions for nurturing your creativity is cultivating awareness. And what I mean by that is sometimes when we're doing something creatively, we don't know that we're enjoying it. I don't know if you've ever been knee deep in a project before and you're thinking, I hate everything about this. Like, this is terrible. Why did I think that this is a good idea? But if you are still paying attention, by the end of the project, you'll realize that, as is with the case with many creative projects, the gratification is delayed until the end. You're like, oh, I do enjoy this. I get a little frustrated in the middle, but actually this is really fun for me. And I do enjoy it once I'm able to get through the weeds of the project. And then also for the same reason, I suggest that you fall in love with the process. So I have a friend, for example, who loves putting together puzzles. And she goes to the VOA, which is a thrift store here in the city where I live, and she buys them like these giant 1,000-piece puzzles. And the last two that she purchased and she took home and did, they were missing a piece in the very middle of the puzzle. And so she made a joke on Facebook about how there must be some kind of sadist traveling around taking out the centerpiece of the puzzles and turning them in and like terrorizing people that way, keeping them like trophies, like serial killer trophies, so just to like mess with other people. But if she did not love the process of making these puzzles, of putting them all together, she would be really disappointed by the time she got to the end and she had done all this work and she didn't get the result she wanted. So again, I'd like to suggest that you disconnect this idea of results or skill with the creativity itself, and falling in love with the process is one way to do it. Just enjoying what you're doing and being less connected to, or less, I guess detached would be a better word, to what's going to happen at the end would be my best suggestion for that. And then also, because nothing kills your creativity more than having that disconnect between what you wanted to happen and what really happened. It can be very discouraging. And then lastly, don't try to be perfect. So perfection is the antithesis of creativity. Yo-Yo Ma explains this really well when he talked about in his masterclass that he loves playing the cello. He's a famous cellist, if you're not familiar with Yo-Yo Ma. he is a famous cellist who plays these amazing concerts, and he talks about how hard he worked to do his first like perfect concert. And so he goes out there and he plays a perfect concert, but he realized he was miserable at the end of it. And the reason for that is when we are using creativity, when we're connecting with that part of ourselves, essentially creativity is freedom. It's the ability to really get wrapped up in the process and the energy and the exchange. And when we're just trying to do something perfectly, we're walking this very narrow pathway of it has to be like this. And so there's a lot more tension, and there's a lot less ability to kind of explore the full capacity at your disposal. So don't try to be perfect. Don't try to do everything right. It sucks the pleasure out of the process of being creative. Just do what you feel compelled to do and enjoy it as much as possible. And so also I want to tell you about how creativity saved my life. So in this photo, we have me and my mom. I'm probably 7 here, and my mom is 27. And I remember this being like the time of her life when she was the most happy, the most stable. And the reason for that was because she was still very much connected to her creativity. At least that's what I believe. Because my mother, she loved to sing. She grew up singing in the church. Her family was very religious. And so she was so good at it that they invited her to come around to different churches and to sing for the congregations. And that's actually how my parents met, was that my father's mother was like, oh, come hear this angel sing. But the next thing we know, the angel is riding off on the back of my father's Harley, who is this like tattooed bad boy at the time. So it didn't end well for them, but it's a lovely origin story. But that was my mother's creativity, was their expression, was her voice. And I think that it helped her to be more resilient and connected to herself during that time. But eventually she gave it up, and the challenges of her life got a lot more difficult because I don't believe she had that outlet. And then also, we know from the research, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the CDC's ACEs, but Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. So the CDC did some research showing that children who struggle with mental health or with substance abuse or chronic health issues, they tend to have a higher ACE score. And the ACEs, you can have up to 10. And each of these experiences kind of raises your risk for developing these issues. And so it can be anything like a divorce, or watching someone you love die, or someone got sick, or I can't think of all of the ones right now off the top of my head, but there's a whole list. And I took the test because I wanted to know how traumatized I was. And I had a score of 8, which is incredibly high. If you don't know, they consider you traumatized if you're above 4. So I'm overachiever. I doubled that score easily. And I also took it for my mother as well, and she also had an 8. And so it really begged the question of, how was I able to go on and have a happy life with loving connections, doing work that I love doing, feeling very joyful in my life? And she had a very different kind of life where she was always struggling, and she did not have those connections. She didn't feel loved and supported. And I really do think it comes down to my connection to my creativity, using that to help build myself up, to give me the connection and joy and self-esteem and resiliency, all those things that we get when we use creativity in service of our wellness. And so I think that that's very important to kind of drive home, as that's essentially. But also, one of the things I want to tell you about is how, when I was a child, and this is connected to the ACEs story, which is that another essential difference between my mother and I was that I had people growing up who recognized creativity in me, or recognized something in me, and they nurtured that even though my home situation was very difficult. And so for my mother, she didn't really have anyone that was there for her who nurtured her in that way. But I was lucky enough to have really amazing teachers. So in 2nd grade, there was Mrs. Cooper, who wrote me a thank you note for a picture that I had drawn her and given to her. And then in 4th grade, there was Mrs. Weatherly, who was the first person to ever tell me that my drawing, or that my story was really good, that I was a good storyteller. And then there was my art teacher, Miss Miller, in high school, who would let me hide in there so I wouldn't get bullied. And I just worked on my mosaics and stuff for the whole hour, the lunch hour. And so these people were really instrumental to helping me feel great about myself, for giving me that verbal feedback that my creativity mattered. And I'm sure that you also have students in your life who are getting the same kind of fulfillment from you, and they may not be able to communicate that to you, because often when we're experiencing really difficult things as children, we can't always articulate that to the adults around us. But creativity is a language. And when all else fails, creativity is often how we reach out and connect. And so I just wanted to put that top of mind, that if you have a child in your class and they're trying to connect with you or speak with you in that way, it's probably essential for them at that time for you to say the kind word or to encourage that, even if you have no idea what you're looking at, frankly. If you're looking at a picture and you don't know what that is, you're like, this is amazing. It really does a lot more than you think it does. It's very normal, I think, at this point, for teachers to feel undervalued and underappreciated, especially in times when the budgets are always being cut and so many other things are being prioritized. You're asked to do a lot with very little. But I do want to make sure that you know that there are people like me out in the world who think that you're amazing and the work you're doing is important, even if the children aren't able to articulate that to you. So please keep that in mind. And I also want to leave you with a final thought, which, in addition to hopefully making all of these permission, we'll call it, having permission to make more creativity in your life, doing things in your professional and personal lives to cultivate that creativity so that you get these wellness benefits, I also want to push you beyond that by doing this. We can call it a journal prompt, or you can do it however you want. But essentially at the top of the page, you would write, I couldn't possibly, and then you would think about your biggest creative dream. So maybe it's, I couldn't possibly be the lead singer of a rock band. I couldn't possibly paint 100-foot mural in my city. I couldn't possibly build that gadget that I've been wanting to build, like on the side of my house for 5 years now. I couldn't possibly learn 5 languages or fly to Europe and backpack, whatever. I mean, maybe we're all a little old to be flying to Europe and backpacking. We got bills and stuff, but maybe for some of us, maybe that's still the dream. But whatever it is, write your I couldn't possibly, and there's no limit to how many that you can do, by the way. I couldn't possibly, as many as you've got. And then start thinking about your first action step. So probably unrealistic to immediately become the front singer for a rock band, but you can buy that guitar you've always wanted, or you can sign up for those lessons that you always wanted, and you can give yourself permission to start down that path and bring more creativity and joy into your days. And so that's the end of my presentation. I hope that I've given you some ideas or some different ways to think about creativity and wellness today, and that you found it useful both in a professional capacity and a personal capacity. This is the QR code to take a survey. So I find that it's really important for me to continue to improve my presentations. I like to know that it's resonating with the audiences. So if you have any feedback for me, I would love it if you would take this. Stephanie, she reminded me before this that she's going to email you. So don't freak out if this is, if you're trying to catch it with your phone and it's not happening, don't worry. Just know that you do need to put in that code at the bottom. It says idea. It'll prompt you for a code when you do try to take the survey. And then also it will offer you to download my free ebook, which is called The Wellness Blueprint, which offers what I consider like the essential tools of developing your wellness. And so you can also get that for free. I can't remember specifically if that link prompts you to sign up for my newsletter. If it does and you're not interested, you can immediately unsubscribe. It doesn't matter. You still get to keep the book. Okay, so I'd love to open it up to questions now, if you have any for me, and turning it over to Stephanie, lady in charge.
Thank you, Kory, so much.